Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Tara Crana. I'm from the Construction Association of New Brunswick, and I'm happy to present Candace Colpitts today from RJ Bartlett Engineering. Candace has been with RJ Bartlett for about 8 years, working on building and fire code consulting. So we're looking forward to hearing from her today about the 2025 NBC updates. Candace, I'll leave it to you now.
Thank you so much, Tara. Hi, everybody. I'm Candace Colpitts with RJ Bartlett. Recently just became a division of CBCL, so that's exciting. I recognize a lot of names on the guest list here today. So if you have seen me give this presentation before, it's going to be a lot of the same material. I've given this to DTI back in November and to the Interior Designers Association back in May as well, or May, sometime in the summer. So, but it can't hurt to hear things twice. Um, we've titled this the 2025 NBC update. So these are the updates that we will be seeing here in New Brunswick this year. However, they are outlining the updates to the 2020 model National Building Code. So just a couple housekeeping items. This is being recorded, FYI, and you have the ability to turn on or off your camera and your mics. If you have a super burning question, please ask it throughout the presentation. I do have a lot of slides though, so it might be best to keep it to the end, but if you think it's important, please speak up. But I will try to aim for about 10, 15 minutes of a question period at the end. And I believe I'm here for an hour and a half. So correct me if I'm wrong, so I don't go through too many slides. So I do have a lot of slides, so we got to get into it here. Okay. So yeah, it's divided into modules. Generally, it's a two-way discussion, but because I have a lot of slides, I'm just going to fire away and you can ask me questions throughout or at the end. I'll do some introductions. I'll go through just some general NBC stuff, including new occupancy types, new construction types, the fire alarm, sprinkler changes, egress and exiting changes, a little teeny tiny bit of accessibility, not really, and we're going to also get into some part 9 stuff if we have time, but I will probably leave out the National Fire Code changes. So apologies if you're really looking forward to that. A little bit about me. I did my mechanical engineering degrees at UNB. Loved Fredericton so much I stuck around, originally from Moncton, and I've been working at RJ Bartlett ever since. So RJ Bartlett, now a division of CBCL, we were established in 1987, just a small company of 22 people, a office in Halifax, an office in Fredericton, and we do fire protection, engineering, building and fire codes consulting. We do some forensics, fire safety planning, and fire protection systems. We do a lot of work all over North America and are part of several committees. So like I said, fire protection, engineering related stuff. Visit our website, feel free. CBCL's website as well, as is up there. Okay, so the NBC, National Building Code of Canada. So that's mainly what I'll be focusing on today. If for some reason I get through the slides super quick, I'll be able to talk about some fire code stuff, but in general, I'll stick to the building code. So as for the evolution of the code, it's available in both the English and French languages. It's adopted by each province in their own way. Some make amendments. New Brunswick, we're just going to be adopting the 2020 with some amendments as well, specifically to accessibility stuff. And the 2020 version, the most recent version that just came out a couple of years ago, is the 15th edition, where the NFC is the 11th edition. And it, as a general rule, cycles every 5 years. And now the CCBFC, which is the Canadian Commission of Building and Fire Codes, who overlooked all of these, changes is now the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes is now kind of overlooking these changes and keeping in mind that we want to harmonize with all the provinces across Canada. And the public reviews, so you can submit, anybody can submit proposed changes for codes, and they generally are reviewed in the fall. And the standards that are developed as well can go into that, could take that into consideration. Okay, so let's get into some of the changes that we see. So just heard word that the NBC is not necessarily going to be adopted April 1st, 2025. That's now been pushed to May 1st, 2025. So keep that in mind. And a lot of the reference standards have been updated as well. Some notable ones, the Canadian Electrical Code, that's been updated to the 2018 version, whereas the 2015 National Building Code referenced the 2012. Another important one is the Sprinkler Code, NFPA 13. So there has been a lot of changes in the NFPA 13 version since 2013. So keep that in mind, but it is noted that there are resources out there to help you, because it's been like restructured. There's been a lot of new, the sections have been switched around. So the 2019, I think it's the 2016 maybe, that it made a lot of changes, but there's references out there that help you connect the dots if you're looking at an older building. And then also the fire alarm code update has been updated from the 2014 to 2019, and of course the NFC has been updated as well. All right, so some defined terms that have changed. Post-disaster building, the definition has changed just slightly, and some additions have been added in what is considered a post-disaster building. So control centers for natural gas distribution, water treatment facilities, water storage facilities, sewage pumping stations are some examples that have been added. Some additional notes to part 1 and 2. The definition of a secondary suite, it's no longer, in the definition, it's no longer defined to be within a prescribed floor area. I'm not really sure how it's changed, but it doesn't really change much of how it's applied, as far as I can tell. Also, in the objective statements where it refers to person, it's clarified now in the 2020 code that person includes emergency responders like firefighters, because they're people too, of course. So we're going to get into farm buildings, because that has been added to the 2020 NBC. And it's just noted that farm buildings are considered low human occupancy. So that is considered one person per 40 square meters of floor area. Great. So let's get into the new occupancy type. So there's one new type is Group B Division 4, which is considered a home type care occupancy. So things like home health aides and medical social services, homemakers and basic assistance care, that's all in home type care. And then where the farm buildings come into play, there's a new Group G, and there's different divisions up to 4, and those are agriculture occupancies. So like I said, home type care occupancies, those have support services to residents. So they're not a care occupancy necessarily, but they provide some services by caregivers for no treatment. And this all would fall under Part 9 of the code. So yeah, services could include like daily assessment of the resident's functioning, some appointment scheduling and supervision of things like medication and nutrition, but no care or treatment. So agricultural occupancies. So if you were a farm building, you had to follow the 1995 National Farming building code. So it's 30 years old now, quite outdated. So now in the NBC, it's defined if you're associated with farming, raising animals, or preparing, marketing, storing, processing agricultural products, and you're on land that's dedicated to farming, then you can meet this code. How this code, as in, I'll get into it. It's part two. But if you are a farm building that fits this description, but are less than 3 stories, less than 600 square meters, then you would fall into the farming code then. So like larger farming facilities are NBC. Okay, so Group G, Division 1 is a high hazard. So things like feed mills, grain elevators, anywhere storing flammable and compressed gases and liquids, that would be high hazard agricultural. And then your Group G, Division 2, similar to your A2, that's kind of like your general, anything that doesn't fit in the other categories. So, you know, animal exercise and training facilities, and packaging and processing of agriculture products and whatever's listed there. Now, Group G Division 3, that is an agricultural occupancy where plants are grown in a building or part thereof that is primarily constructed of roofs and walls designed to transmit light, so greenhouses. And then finally, your Group G Division 4, these are your farm buildings that aren't intended for human occupancy. So your grain bins and, you know, silos and biomass facilities where there's people only in there, like just periodically for maintenance and not meant to be in there generally. So if you meet those requirements, you can fall into part 2 of Division B of the 2020 NBC. So just in general, the scope, it considers fire, structural, heating, and venting requirements of farm buildings. It covers the processes and operations that are carried out in the facility, and covers any risk of explosion or high flammability in those conditions. So some exceptions for what kind of occupancies you can have together with agricultural. So your high hazard Group G Division 1 or your low human occupancy Division 4, those major occupancies can't be with a assembly, care, or residential occupancy. And then your Group G Division 2 or 3, so your greenhouses or general Group G, those can't be in the same building with a Group A Division 1 or 3 or Group B occupancy. So for fire alarm systems, if you have a high hazard agriculture occupancy with over 25 people, you need to have a fire alarm system. And this is if you're not sprinklered. And also if you're a Group G Division 2 or 3 that has over 150 people, over 1 story, or has a basement for anything else other than service equipment, then you would need a fire alarm system. But if you're sprinklered, you need a fire alarm system. Anyway, this is for unsprinklered facilities. So in your high hazard, you would need a single stage fire alarm and then a single or 2-stage. Okay, so we're going to get into some general requirements. So in combustible construction, there's been some changes to the exterior cladding requirements, and the main one is in the center there, sentence 31482. So there is now, if you have buildings that meet 32251 or 60, which is your Group C residential and Group D office buildings up to 6 stories combustible, and it's only facing one street, the cladding on each wall needs to be either non-combustible or a wall assembly meeting CAN ULC S134. So this has been clarified in the code in a couple of instances. So additionally, you can meet, for that exterior cladding, you can meet Appendix D6. And if you meet that, then you would satisfy that requirement of being tested in accordance with CANULC S134. And so this hasn't changed, but we're just bringing this up again as a refresher. So here's your table D611 as for a couple of examples as to what assemblies could meet that requirement for your exterior wall. So moving on to non-combustible construction, there is now a new element that is exempt as a minor combustible component. So wood blocking that's used for attaching windows in an exterior wall, that is now exempt. So you can have that in a non-combustible building if that's combustible. Another exciting change to the 2020. So in non-combustible construction, you weren't really permitted to have a curtain wall. So each window had to be an individual unit separated with non-combustible construction. You had to have at least a meter of non-combustible construction separating each story, and you were limited to 40% of the aggregate exterior openings in each fire compartment. So that hasn't been changed since 1965, so it was about time to change it. Now you're allowed to have combustible window sashes and frames in non-combustible construction, provided that they're non-contiguous between stories, so that they don't have direct contact. And I don't believe there's an actual distance measurement. You don't need that 1 meter in between each story. Okay, and some more, this again, just reiterating that in non-combustible construction as well, if you have an exterior wall assembly that meets CANULC S134 or Appendix D6, then you are good to have it. Okay, moving on to fire separations. So there has been some clarifications added for the requirements of fire separation continuity and fire stopping certain penetrations. And this also provides some consistency between parts 3 and 9. And I guess to note is in the 2015, the last version of the code, a lot of the requirements required you to have smoke tight joints, whereas now a lot of joints need to be fire stopped. Another change is that safety glazing was added to the temporize table for glazing. So safety glazing is anything that meets its standard CAN CGSB 12.1 safety glazing. So this standard basically just looks at the performance of the glazing in terms of reducing the likelihood of like cutting and piercing injuries if the glazing were to break, but it doesn't address things like the strength or the durability or the fire resistance of it. So these are just to, sort of replace wired glass. Another thing that's been added to this table, you can see highlighted, is that the 45-minute firewall option as well. So more on fire stopping, some additions. There's now restrictions as to what can be cast in place. So only steel, ferrous, copper, concrete, or masonry penetrations can be cast in place. And also there's some additions where the T rating, so when you have your fire stop that needs an FT rating, the T rating can be dropped for service equipment penetrations through a horizontal fire separation where they're contained within the fire separation. So that's what sentences 6 and 7 of Article 3191 are describing. So some other additions here, the service equipment, basically you need to fire stop instead of it needing to be incorporated at the time of testing. That wording's been changed. And there's been some additions for the permissions of combustible outlet boxes and some fire stopping as well. So in the 2015 code, these new clauses here, in the 2015, the combustible drain, waste, and vent piping needed to be fire stopped with an F rating, and also a 50 Pascal pressure differential, whereas now in the 2020, the 50 Pascal pressure differential only applies to 3+ stories. See there in clause B. Another addition is that there's some added requirements for the transitions between combustible and non-combustible piping for drain, waste, and vent pipes. And your F rating for those fire stops need to be not less than the fire resistance rating of the separation being penetrated. Another addition to part 3, this is similar to part 9. Before, if you had a room with combustible, like trash and recycling, you needed to have a 1-hour fire separation. However, it can be now in 2020, you're permitted to go down to 45 minutes if the floors can be 45 minutes in your building. So that's noted there. Okay, one of the more exciting additions to the 2020 NBC is encapsulated mass timber construction, EMTC. So the research of this construction type has really shown that when you encapsulate mass timber, it can really perform the same as non-combustible in a lot of ways. And this is used a lot in Europe and successful there. And we encapsulate the timber with a 50-minute encapsulation rating. And then there's some permissions for what can be exposed, so I can get into that. So this EMTC would be your beams, your columns, arches, walls, floors, roof assemblies. They need to be a heavy solid mass. You're not permitted to have concealed spaces unless permitted by 31634. So that would be like if it's sprinklered or filled with a fiber insulation. And you need to have smooth, flat surfaces, and you can't have sharp projections or thin sections. And things that would be used to encapsulate this mass timber would be gypsum board, gypsum concrete, non-combustible materials, anything meeting CANB S135. So that's the standard test method for the determination of combustibility parameters of building materials using oxygen consumption calorimeter or cone calorimeter, or a combination of all the above. And the building materials that are permitted in an EMTC building would be anything conforming to subsection 315, so the same for non-combustible construction. So mass timber, it can include your heavy timber, glue lam, structural composite lumber, cross-laminated timber, nail laminated timber, and dowel laminated timber, to name a few. So similar to your heavy timber requirements, there's certain dimensional requirements that you need to have for EMTC. So those are listed in 3163. Now your encapsulation ratings. Some examples of what can be an encapsulation rating of 50 minutes. You have your gypsum concrete that is at least 38 millimeters thick, or 2 layers of 1/2 inch type X gypsum, or anything that is in accordance with CANB S146. And so you don't need to have a 50-minute encapsulation rating if less than 10% of the wall area within that suite or fire compartment has a flame spread rating of less than 150. If the exposed surfaces face the same direction and the flame spread rating is less than 150, if less than 10% of your ceiling area within a suite has a flame spread rating of less than 150, or if less than 25% of your ceiling area with no mass timber walls has a flame spread rating of less than 75, not 150. So, more on EMTC, you are permitted to have combustible window sashes and frames if the windows are separated by other openings by non-combustible construction or EMTC. You have the 1 meter of separation between your stories, and then your aggregate area of your openings is limited to 40%. So similar to non-combustible beforehand. So unfortunately, no curtain walls yet. So when it comes to exterior cladding on an EMTC building, you need to be non-combustible, or you're permitted to be combustible, permitted in accordance with 3169, and that provides your limits on your aggregate area, separation between individual open portions, and you have flame spread rating limitations. You're allowed to have up to 100% of combustible cladding on the first story if it's within 15 meters of a fire department access route. And, or if, again, the CANUL CS 134 that's mentioned in clause 31551B. And you can have up to 10% of combustible cladding if 3237 is met. Now for stairs, you are permitted to have combustible stairs in the MTC, even in the exit stairwells, provided that the landings meet 3163 and 3164, which just provides some dimensional criteria. You can't have sharp edges or concealed spaces, and your exposed mass timber construction needs to be protected from adjacent spaces, other gypsum concrete, non-combustible construction, etc. And also you can have combustible stairs permitted with a suite. Now, interior finishes that are combustible, you're allowed to have up to 1 millimeter for walls and ceilings. You can have up to 25 millimeters if your flame spread rating is less than 150 on walls. And then for ceilings, you can have up to 25 millimeters thick if your flame spread rating is less than 25. You can have up to 10% of your ceiling if your flame spread rating is less than 150, and up to 25 millimeters of fire retardant treated wood. And again, no flow plastics unless it's less than 1 millimeter thick. Now there's 2 new construction articles that allow you to go up to 12 stories with EMTC, so that's pretty exciting, and I'll get into that in more detail in the next few slides. So for construction requirements, in the 2015, your six-story combustible group C and D buildings, if they faced one street, you had to have at least 25% of your perimeter within 15 meters, but now you're permitted to have as low as 10% of your perimeter within 15 meters, provided that the cladding conforms with 31482, which is basically saying you need to be non-combustible or meet CANUL CS 134. So balconies that are on buildings in accordance with 32248 and 57, which are your EMTC / non-combustible up to 12 stories, group C or D. Any balconies need to be either non-combustible or constructed in accordance with 3163, which I believe is those the mass timber requirements. Now there's some new mezzanine exemptions. So mezzanine, fire resistance rating of a mezzanine is now waived for gyms and pools and arenas and rinks. In 2015, it only provided an exemption for roof ratings, but now it provides a mezzanine exemption. Okay, so Article 32248. So this is your Group C building. It needs to be sprinklered. You can go up to 12 stories and up to 42 meters high. You can have EMTC or non-combustible construction. You're limited to a building area of 6,000 square meters. You need to have 2-hour floor assemblies and 1-hour mezzanines, and load-bearing walls, columns, arches, etc. have a fire resistance rating not less than that of the supported assembly. Additionally, any floor assemblies within dwelling units that's over 1 story, those floor assemblies need to be 1 hour, but they don't need to be constructed as fire separations. And what you can have your Group A Division 2 or Group E mercantile occupancy storage garages, provided that your assembly isn't located below or is located below, sorry, the 4th story. Your mercantile can be located up to the 3rd story or up to the 2nd story, sorry. And then your storage garage located up to the 4th story, so below the 5th story. That's what it says. It's interesting, and I'll get into that a bit later, but the wording has changed a little bit for it used to say, so this is a new construction article, but there's some other ones where it's changed the wording from up to the 4th story to below the 5th story, so it's just weird that they did that. Okay, so your next new construction article is 32257, which is your Group D, up to 12 stories, sprinklered, up to 42 meters, up to 6,000 square meters in area, can be encapsulated mass timber or non-combustible, 2-hour floors, 1-hour mezzanine, and you can have your assembly up to the 3rd story, you can have mercantile up to the 2nd, and storage garages up to the 4th. Very similar to the Group C. Yeah, so this is where the wording was changed. These construction articles here for your Group C's and D's up to 6 stories sprinklered. So Group A and E occupancy, Group A Division 2 and Group E occupancy is permitted below the 3rd story, so up to the 2nd. And storage garages permitted up to the 3rd, below the 4th. And it's noted that Group D occupancies that meet 32257, that new construction article, you are considered a high building if you are over 18 meters above grade. Okay, now, and lastly for the construction stuff, when it comes to elevators, the 2015 used to require that electrical conductors be to have 1-hour protection in accordance with CANULC S101, but now if you're you can have electrical conductors that conform to CANULC S139 instead. And that's provided your circuit integrity rating is at least an hour. Okay, now moving on to fire alarm and protection systems. So fire alarms are now not required in a residential occupancy that's not sprinklered if you have 4 suites or fewer that share a common means of egress, or if each suite has direct access to an exterior exit facility leading to grade. This is, yeah. So a new requirement that's been added to 2020 in BC is that heat tracing cables on standpipe risers and sprinkler lines, they now need electrical supervision and be transmitted to the fire department. And sentence 6 there hasn't changed. So this is a interesting fact. So research has shown that low frequency signals, so anything between 470 and 570 hertz, that's the best at waking sleeping people. So what's been added is that a low frequency signal needs to be in residential occupancies for um, alarms in sleeping rooms. And also there was another clarification added to the code where that the ambient noise level that's mentioned in sentence 7 needs to be determined when intervening doors are closed. That clarification wasn't in there before. So in the 2015 NBC, it was only required that visible signals be included in buildings or portions where there's people with use being used by people with a hearing impairment, in assembly occupancies where the performances could exceed 100 decibels, or in any floor area where the ambient noise was over 87 decibels, or where there's hearing protection, an audiometric booth, or a sound insulating enclosure. So that still remains. However, there's additions now. So now in any corridor used by the public in your Group A Division 2 occupancies, you need to have visible signals. In public corridors serving assembly, care, residential, office, or mercantile occupancies, those need to have visible signals, as well as at least 10% of suites in a hotel or motel, and in washrooms, except for washrooms within residential suites, care suites, or patient sleeping rooms. So, like I said, in at least 10% of hotels and motels, that visible component needs to be on your smoke alarms. And that's in accordance with CANB CES 524. And then even without a fire alarm system, in at least 10% of the sleeping rooms, your smoke alarms need to have a visible component. Another interesting addition to the code is that in residential occupancies, when you're using smoke detectors in lieu of smoke alarms, there's now a new sound requirement, whereas before there wasn't any decibel level specified, and now they specify that you need to be between 75 and 110 decibels. So for sprinkler requirements, Article 32512, the current wording, and like I said, current as in 2015, of this sentence requires that, well, it limits the scope of NFPA 13D to residential buildings that just have 1 or 2 dwelling units, and also some care occupancies. But the scope of NFPA 13D is now expanded to include row houses. So this just resulted in inconsistency and frequent alternative solutions, but it also limited the voluntary installation of sprinklers in row houses. It just was complicated. So now the 2020 allows for residential occupancies with more than 2 dwelling units to have a sprinkler system in accordance with NFPA 13D. So some exceptions, though, you can't have a unit above another, except you can have a secondary suite above one. All suites need to be vertically separated from one another by a 1 hour fire separation, and that fire separation needs to be continuous to the underside of the roof deck. Each unit needs to have its own water supply, and the sprinkler system design needs to be passive purge. So that I didn't know what that means before this, but it's connected to like the domestic water supply. And if sprinklers are used to reduce limiting distances, then all rooms that are adjacent to that exposing building face also need to be sprinklered as well. So Another clarification that was added to the code was that closely spaced sprinklers around draft stops, they don't need to be installed at every floor opening unless required by subsection 328. So I'll get into that in a couple slides here. Now, there's some new lighting requirements. So they added some minimum lighting requirements where the entire length of escalators and moving walks need to be at least 100 lux at tread level. Any controls required by 3826, so that's like electrical switches, thermostats, faucets, door hardware, and intercom switches in barrier-free environments. Lighting there needs to be at least 100 lux. If visual information is provided at those controls, that info also needs to be provided with lighting requirements, but at 200 lux. And any sign displaying this visual information as well, 200 lux. Also, it's been added that emergency lighting is now required at doors with magnetic locks and also in universal washrooms, showers, and changing rooms. And there's a new exemption as well, emergency power supply for equipment for water for fire suppression. It doesn't need to be provided for sprinkler systems conforming to NFPA 13D. So back to that closely spaced sprinklers. So this edition, you need to have your closely spaced sprinklers draft stops if you're like an atrium and you follow those special requirements of interconnected floor spaces. But if you're a large opening, it's not needed. And this is because, the forces of, a fire within that atrium would be so strong that it bypasses the draft stops and is essentially useless, apparently. So that's why it was specified here. And if you are not if you are, but if you have a floor opening for an escalator or inclined walkway, then you need to have your closely spaced sprinklers and draft stops in accordance with NFPA 13 now, if you want to waive those special 328 requirements of interconnected floor spaces. Okay, moving on to safety within floor areas, and about halfway done my time, and I'm at slide 84 of 158, so that's actually a really good sign. Okay, so in the section of headroom and protruding objects, there in the 2015, the headroom clearances was just, exit head clearances, and you didn't need to consider protruding, they didn't have any exceptions for protruding objects, but that has been added to the 2020. So if you have any protruding element within 1980 millimeters of the floor, you can't project more than 100 millimeters horizontally into paths of travel. And this is just, so that the sweep of a cane can detect that protruding object. So, and it's permitted to be over 100 millimeters if it is within 680 millimeters of the floor vertically, so that the cane can detect it. So doors and hardware requirements. So this is an exciting one to keep note of. The doors that are in access to exits or public corridors, the minimum width has changed from 800 to 850 millimeters if there's only one door leaf, or if there's more than one leaf, then the active leaf is to have a width of at least 850 millimeters. Another addition is that the door release hardware, before it was only specified that it needed to be below 1.2 meters of the floor, but now there's a minimum introduced. So you need to be between 900 and 1,100 millimeters of the floor. That's where your door hardware needs to be. So tactile walking surfaces. This is a new addition to the 2020 NBC. And you need to have tactile walking surfaces in some instances. So at the tops of flights of unenclosed stairs, or where you have drop-off edges where there's a change in elevation of at least 300 millimeters that doesn't have a guard. So things like pools and things where there's like transit platforms as well. Those are areas that wouldn't have a guard. They need to meet CSAB 651, and you don't need to apply these tactile walking surfaces in service spaces, bleachers, on stages, industrial occupancies, or if you're within a dwelling unit, or for stairs serving no more than 2 dwelling units. So in assembly occupancies, you need to have panic hardware. So there's some clarifications that have been added to this door release mechanism. And that is basically you need to extend at least half the width of the door. That wasn't there before. And also the height of that needs to be within 900 and 1,100 millimeters of the floor. So safety glazing, like I said before, that was introduced in the temperature rise table earlier. And there's an addition now that glazing in all fixed and operable panels of doors and windows in assembly occupancies need to meet the safety glazing requirement. So there's some exceptions. So when the bottom of the glazing is at least 15-25 millimeters above the floor, then you don't need to have the safety glazing. And where the glazing opening in a door doesn't permit a sphere of over 75 millimeters through it, you don't need it. And then if you have a walking surface next to a window and it's over 950 millimeters away from that window, you don't need to have your safety glazing either. Now, openable windows in residential occupancies, it's just kind of been reworded. So now it needs to be released with tools, with a mechanism requiring tools or special knowledge. So the complete opposite of an exit or egress door. And they also removed there's like a window dimensional criteria of 380 millimeters. That's no longer mentioned. So you can have that mechanism or have a guard at the window, one of the two, for openable windows in residential occupancies. Now moving on to exiting. So similar to access to exits and public corridors, the minimum exit door width has changed from 850. So that's in your assembly occupancies, detention, residential, business and personal services group D, mercantile, and industrial. And that used to be 800. I guess we're getting bigger as a population. Now, tactile signage. This is new to 2020, just in an effort to make it more inclusive and accessible. You need to have tactile signage on the approach side of an exit. You need to have it in exit stairs, within the exit stair for emergency crossover access. You need to have them at electromagnetic locking devices and for floor numbering and identification of stair shafts. That's where you need to include the tactile signage as well. Now, handrails, these dimensions have changed as well. So the circular cross section needs to be within 30 and 50 millimeters, whereas before that upper limit was 43, so that's increased. And same with the non-circular cross-section perimeter, that upper limit of 160 used to be 125 millimeters. And same with the largest cross-sectional dimension is now 57 max, but it used to be a max of 45. So our hands are getting bigger too, apparently. Now, ramp slopes. These have changed a little bit too. So in the 2015, you needed to have a max slope of 1 in 10 in assembly, care, treatment, detention, or residential occupancies. That was 1 in 6 in industrial, 1 in 8 in all other occupancies, and then 1 in 10 for exterior ramps. Whereas now it's shortened. You need your max permitted slope, it needs to be uniform 1 in 12, and then industrial occupancies 1 in 6 interior and 1 in 10 for exterior. Door release hardware. So, couple of clarifications here. Again, the bar needs to extend at least half of the width of the door, and it needs to release the latch, and the door swing needs to be in the direction of travel. So those haven't changed, but the width of the actual device is updated. Now, there's an added exemption for limited use elevators. Now they don't need to accommodate a stretcher. It was just found that, limited use elevators weren't necessary for that, for those activities. So those are designed with ASME A17.1/CSA B44. Now, this subclause has been reworded to include EMTC. So plenums with a floor or roof assembly don't need to conform to 315.18.1 and 3651 if totally enclosed raceways with an FT6 rating are provided in buildings of non-combustible construction or EMTC. Okay, so that was part 3. We're getting into part 8, and this is a quick one because there are no changes to part 8. So safety measures at construction and demolition sites, just keep on doing what you're doing. Now, part 9. I'm looking at the time, and we're going to be able to do part 9. Great. So, open risers rather, there's some new added exceptions for open risers. So you're permitted to have open risers in a part 9 building for interior and exterior stairs that serve a single dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite, fire escape stairs just for maintenance or service rooms, and industrial occupancies. But storage garages, you can't have open risers. Now, there's a couple of additions to guards. So the 2020 NBC for Part 9 removed the requirements for guards, or removed a part of sentence 1 here, where it used to say the adjacent surface within 1.2 meters of the walking surface has a slope of more than 1 and 2. That's no longer there. So basically, if you have an elevation difference of more than 600 millimeters, that's where you need to have a guard. And clause 4B, you need to have a guard at these openable windows, or, like I said before, this mechanism that can only be released with special tools or knowledge needs to be applied to these windows. And then that other dimension of 300 millimeters that was removed from this sentence. And sentence 5, there used to be quite an extensive list in 2015 to exempt these windows needing protection with guards, but that's just been simplified now. So anything more than 900 millimeters above the finished floor or less than 800 millimeters above the ground on the other side of the window, those don't need guards. Now, openings of guards, this one's interesting. So sentence 2, it's basically saying that if you were to subject the vertical elements of a guard to a live load of a 1 or 0.1 kilonewtons in opposite directions, so I think that's like trying to like pull it apart, then you need, that's how you assess where you need to have like the distance between your guards, so that 100 millimeters, for example. So that's a new addition. And another new addition too is that from the bottom of your guard to the top of your tread, that little triangle, as you could see in the image, that triangle needs to prevent the passage of a sphere of 150 millimeters. So I think that was interesting. But in industrial occupancies, that doesn't apply. Door hardware, similar to part 3, the height requirements for door hardware changed. Now there's a minimum and the maximum is lower. So home type care occupancies, I mentioned almost an hour ago here that home type care occupancies were to follow part 9. So we're going to get into that now. So in order to conform with part 9 as a home type care occupancy, you need to have 10 sleeping accommodations or fewer. Because if you're over than that, you need to go into part 3. So 10 or less, you comply with the detached housing requirement in part 9, and you can sprinkler in accordance with NFPA 13D, and you need to have at least a 30-minute water supply for that system. So exemptions to where you don't need a sprinkler system. So if you are a home type care occupancy that is 1 story, that doesn't have a basement or a mezzanine, and if your sleeping accommodations are only for 4 people or less or fewer, and then that floor area is served by at least 2 barrier-free means of egress, and you have some smoke alarm requirements listed there, and you have emergency lighting in your common means of egress, and if you comply with section 3.8, the accessibility requirements, then you don't need a sprinkler system in that case. So a lot of details to consider. Another example too, if you want to go up to 2 stories, then you can have up to 4 residents, but only on the first story, and that story needs to have at least 2 barrier-free means of egress, some smoke alarm requirements similar to the last one, and also emergency lighting in common means of egress. Your air handling system needs to shut down from the signal from your residential fire warning system. Your first story needs to comply with the accessibility requirements of 3.8, and any basement is separated by a door and continuous smoke tight barrier with at least 12.7 millimeters half-inch gypsum board on both sides and the underside of the floor ceiling framing. So just in case you want to get away from those sprinkler requirements, that's what you need to do. And like I said earlier, if you have 11 people in your home type care occupancy, you're pushed into a Group B Division 3 care occupancy. So these requirements have been updated and is very similar to the ones in part 3. They were harmonized to be closer to one another. So in 2015, the continuity of a fire separation or smoke tight barrier needed to be maintained when abutting other fire separations or smoke tight barriers, walls, ceiling, floors, roofs. And gypsum joints needed to be per CSAA 82.31 with flexible sealant or tape around the penetrations. But now the continuity of a fire stop needs to be per CANULC S115 with an FT rating. Floors and exterior walls, those joints need to be fire stopped, and the 2020 introduced ASTM E2307 for that. Gypsum joints still were the same, and then your joints where if you're if you have gypsum attached to the framing members, those joints are exempt from those requirements. And there's been some changes to Articles 9.10.9.6 and 9.10.9.7, and it's been revised to more articles, basically. They just restructured it a little bit. So I'll just briefly go through those. Piping penetrations were brought into their own article, which is 3.10.9 or 3.10, geez, 9.10.9.7. And yeah, so and this aligns too with part 3. So for outlet boxes and service equipment, there's now a new minimum offset distance between outlets on either side of a fire separation, where I don't believe it was specified before, but it's 600 millimeters. Um, your outlet area, that is quantified there. Same with your annular space in an outlet box, and it also clarifies some non-combustible outlet box exceptions. And again, this is one that's restructured. Okay, so separating public corridors in a Part 9 building. So this is a new exception in the 2020 NBC, so no fire separation required in a sprinklered floor area between your public corridor and a bathroom. So spaces containing plumbing fixtures. So this is aligned with part 3 as well now. So if that bathroom and corridor are separated from the remainder of the story by the fire separation that's required between the corridor and the remainder of the story, then you're good. And if the plumbing fixtures aren't within a dwelling unit or suite. And this is similar to part 3. So this exception for combustible refuse and recycling rooms, these rating requirements haven't changed, although part 3 then introduced it. But in part 9, they added materials for recycling into the requirement. So now any room with materials for recycling in addition to combustible refuse, you need to have a 1 hour rating, or it can go down to 45 minutes where your floor assembly doesn't exceed 45 minutes, or if you can sprinkler the room. So the 2020 now clarifies that spatial separation requirements don't apply to carports as per section 9.35. So if a carport, you're considered a carport if you're 60% open to the exterior, where if you're 60% or less, then it's a garage. So that's where that comes from. Now there's a new sentence 7 here. Now you're in glazed openings in an exposing building face. Your maximum aggregate area of glazed openings is permitted to be doubled if the glazed openings consist of glass block, or if the building is sprinklered where all adjacent rooms to the exposing building face that have glazing are also sprinklered. And protection around cooktops. So there's an added fire resistance requirement. So before, what was specified was your fire resistance rating needed to be equivalent to 9.5 millimeters of gypsum, which was pretty arbitrary, but now it specifies that gypsum board not less than 9.5 millimeters thick, or any material providing a fire resistance rating of not less than 10 minutes, and a flame spread rating of not more than 25. So just quantifies and clarifies. Or cooktops. any finishes or cabinets or framing within 450 millimeters of a cooktop area. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. I am I have a few slides at the end that are specific to some proposed changes to the 2025 National Building Code that I really want to share with you guys. So what I'm going to do is very, like, you're not even going to get a chance to read these slides, but I'm just going to go through them in a way that reminds me of some of like the major changes to the National Fire Code. Um, so let's just zip through them. So yeah, a lot of these are just adding some requirements around home type care and encapsulated mass timber construction where those weren't mentioned before. So there's a lot that's just incorporating those. Another thing is that Section 2.8 of the National Fire Code is now restructured in a way that all of the fire safety planning requirements are all in one area. They used to be peppered throughout the code, but now they're in one spot, so that's really nice. Also, farm buildings, there's a new section 2.14, so that just kind of goes over some farm requirements. And another exciting change is that before flammable and combustible liquids, they used to be like there's different tiers of your like hazard of combustible and flammable liquids. Those used to be determined solely on your flash point, but now for these water miscible liquid mixtures that are listed, so methanol, ethanol, 2-propanol acetone, and acetic acid, it's now defined by certain percentages. So just for example, methanol, if you have a water methanol mixture with less than 20% of methanol, it's no longer considered a flammable liquid. So it's combustible. So then you would be exempt from certain requirements there. So that's pretty exciting. Okay. Ooh, I should probably mention this one though. So when you have a building under construction that's um, using EMTC, you need to have at least 2 stairways provided during construction for buildings that conform to 32248 and 32257. So those are the new ones, the up to 12 stories EMTC groups C and D. And those have like a few requirements that are kind of extensive. So they need to be separated with a 30-minute fire resistance rating from the rest of the floor assembly. The doors need to be provided with 45-minute solid core wood doors, hollow metal doors, or doors with half-inch gypsum mechanically fastened, or a minimum of 20-minute fire protected doors. And they need to swing on a vertical axis and close automatically. So quite extensive for a construction site. Um, yeah, so those are the major ones. Okay, so 2025 proposed changes to the NBC. So 2020, the building code, it requires that the protection of foam plastics and insulation need to have things like gypsum or lath and plaster, masonry, concrete, any thermal barrier meeting CANUL CS 124 to be covering these foam plastics, but there's going to be a new standard introduced potentially it's CANUL CS 145, which is the standard method of test for evaluation of protective coverings for foamed plastic insulation. So if you have this like 10-minute coating rating, you can protect foamed plastics this way instead of those other gypsum, lath and plaster, masonry, etc. coatings. So this would permit like intumescent coatings and like DC 315, for example, to be permitted by the building code. And another one, elevator car dimensions. Right now, at least one elevator on each story needs to have dimensions to accommodate a stretcher, but there's going to be a clarification potentially where elevator machine room penthouses aren't considered stories for the purposes of this elevator car dimension. So if there's an elevator that goes that's just meant for servicing and going to this elevator machine room penthouse, for example. It doesn't need to meet those stretcher requirements. So the most exciting one that I wanted to talk about was that there is a lot of talk that you might have heard about a single exit being permitted for residential buildings up to 6 stories in height. And, the 2020, the current codes allow for a single exit, under dimensional criteria, occupant load, travel distance criteria, can only go up to 2 stories, applies. And this new requirement would apply to residential buildings. You need to have 4 units or fewer per floor. You're only permitted up to 150 square meters per unit. The building needs to be sprinklered and has a fire alarm. That critical one stair needs to be pressurized. So this is something that British Columbia has been implementing, and I believe it might even be up for 8 stories there. I'm not 100% sure, but this is all coming from the political pressure and housing initiatives, because we want to try to build as many residential spots as we can, especially in those densely packed cities. However, this really is in development. It's pretty controversial, so we might not even get there till 2030, but it is something interesting that's been talked about quite a bit. And another requirement that could be introduced, or not, a section there for Part 9 buildings being altered to improve the energy performance of HVAC and service water heating systems above ground and below grade, assemblies, fenestrations, doors, skylights, and the air tightness of air barrier systems. So those things would be covered. And yeah, a couple new proposed changes for the NFC in 2025. One of them is there's an introduction potentially for flame testing requirements for screens and curtains used in farm buildings. And also some limitations for the quantities of dangerous goods and compressed gases in laboratories. So, okay, I can't believe I got through all the slides with 15 minutes to go. What I've done, I've added my my email up on the screen if you have a question that I can't answer, but I will do my very best to answer as many questions that I can today. And I am looking now at questions. And can you clarify what has changed from the 2015 to the 2020 for combustible cladding on exterior walls required to meet S134? So combustible, so that slide, try to find it here. That would be, there's in combustible construction, oh, never mind, for combustible cladding on exterior walls. So $134, am I on that right slide? So one of the changes is that, excuse me, for buildings that are the group C and group D up to 6 stories, combustible, those are permitted to have those, if it's facing one street, the cladding needs to be non-combustible or conform to CANUL CS 134. So that was added. And also the changes for like the combustible window sashes and frames. That's one that was added so you can have curtain walls in non-combustible construction now. And those are the ones coming to mind, but I can articulate that much better in an email. Okay, so another question. If using a cladding product that meets S134 to protect foam plastics in a building over 3 stories, say foam was used in a 6-story mid-rise, as required in 3238, the S134 testing would still have to demonstrate it has been done to meet subclause 3155B. Hmm. Bear with me here. Yeah, so I think what you're asking is if you have a product that meets S134, it would need to meet that, like the testing criteria that's listed in subclause 1B with like the flame, like the 5 meters or whatever it is. Yeah, 5 flaming on the, yeah, and yes, yeah, because when it's a lot of these requirements are just referring back to clause 31551B. So it's not just meeting, and I apologize for not clarifying that, but it's not just meeting the CANUL CS 134. I can read it here, but it needs to meet S134 and satisfy certain testing criteria. So the flaming on or in the wall assembly can't spread more than 5 meters above the opening, and the heat flux during the flame exposure on the wall can't be more than 35 kilowatts per square meter when measured 3.5 meters above the opening. So that's some additional criteria to keep in mind when you're testing these exterior wall assemblies. However, if you are meeting that Appendix D6, then you are deemed to satisfy those. You don't need to also meet that criteria. And no, it's not changed in 2020. The testing criteria hasn't changed. No. Thank you. Hey, does anybody have any questions or even comments or anything? Because we're going to be giving this presentation again to other subgroups here. So if there's anything that you would like, that you would have liked to see, feel free to let us know. And again, yeah, like feel free to reach out by email anytime if you have a quick question about any of this stuff. I'll be happy to help and give you a more thorough answer. And yeah, I can share a PDF of this presentation for sure. I think so. Let me just check. Like I have before, so pretty sure it's okay. But
Okay, on that note, yes, we will, as long as we get the A-OK from Candace, we will send the PowerPoint presentation around. And I believe we will be trying to post the recording as well. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Candace, for spending your lunch with us today. And as Candace said, please reach out to them if you have more questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much,
Candace.
everybody.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.